In all professions, it is necessary to be aware of the responsibility that each one has, and precisely for that reason, in difficult times, when you feel pressured, stop to think about the consequences of your decisions. Always, from doctors to teachers and of course also engineers. During our engineer career, we had a module that marked us especially. It was named History of Aviation and Professional Ethics. But this subject marked us not only because the topics were very interesting, which in fact they were, but also because we think that this subject made us better professionals, although we suspect that more than the subject it was because of the teacher. Ruben Dapica is called, and he made us reflect on controversial historical points. For example, were the atomic bombs dropped in the Second World War justified? At first, there were two clear opinions, those who said no, and those who said yes. And the interesting thing was to see how he made out both those who thought one thing and those who thought the other. Because in reality, to give an opinion on a fact of the past is very simple. The complicated thing is to give the information available at that time and make the decision there.
Okay, so get ready because in this video we are going to talk about the biggest negligence in aerospace engineering history, the Boeing 737 MAX. The things that we are going to explain here are so frustrating, so please just watch the entire video and then at the end we want to know your opinion. As always, we will leave all the documentation down on the description below, so you will be able to read it by yourself.
When we see an aircraft, we only look at the object itself, the aircraft, but we don't realize the interpersonal relationships that people have and how their interests and objectives influence when working on that aircraft. Everyone will always do their work based on their interests that surround them. For example, those can be spend less budget, doing the job as fast as possible, or anything like that. The problem is when those interests interfere with the safety of the mission, putting at risk future users and operators. That's where the situation becomes complicated. A clear example of this could be when the interest of putting an aircraft to fly as soon as possible becomes more important than the safety of the aircraft and the operation. This factor is usually common in many accidents, but almost always comes from the operational part or maintenance, or perhaps by the airline. What is not so common to see is the case that the manufacturer is the one who puts the cost and manufacturing times ahead of safety. To show you how crazy is this, if a mechanic or a pilot commits a negligent act, looking at the possible potential danger is something less dangerous than if the one who commits the negligence is the airline itself as a company philosophy or way of operating. But the worst case scenario is when the manufacturer in the design stage commits negligence, because this, if they manage to be certified at the potential level of danger, can end up in many more cases of accidents. We're talking about an entire fleet of aircraft distributed by hundreds of airlines in dozens of countries that can potentially fail. It is unforgivable that something like this could happen, playing with the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. We want to show this not so pretty part of aeronautics and in general of the human being, not only so that it doesn't happen again, but also to keep in mind that situations like this can occur at any time in our lives. Maybe not on such a large scale, but always in all jobs there are times when you will feel pressure to make decisions that may not be the right ones. Please, that day, remember this video. Well, let's go on with it, with the negligence case of the Boeing 737 MAX. For this, we must understand the historical context in which it was developed. Back in 2010, Airbus began to develop the A320neo, an upgrade model for the A320 that could consume much less fuel, and therefore many companies that had been using the Boeing 737 were ordering A320neo aircraft to replace the old Boeing 737. So Boeing had to do something, a new aircraft that could allow them to compete with the A320neo. As they didn't have time to make an aircraft from scratch, they decided to remodel and upgrade the famous Boeing 737, an aircraft designed in the 60s, which for decades has been undergoing changes that have resulted in new, more modern and economical variants, but all of them starting from the same aircraft. As we have already explained in this channel, to improve the efficiency of engines, you must increase the size of the fan, but this was not possible in the Boeing 737 MAX, as it is a low aircraft with the engines of the previous version already very close to the ground. Therefore, in the previous versions of the Boeing 737, the bottom of the engine cowling is flat, so it avoids hitting the ground. So in order to increase the size of the engines, they had to put them forward and upward with respect to the wing. But of course, after many tests, they realized that this could affect the aerodynamics of the aircraft when flying at high angles of attack. The engine cooling would generally lift in those cases, and therefore they decided to incorporate a system that could detect when the aircraft was behaving unstable, and by means of software corrections in the trim of the horizontal stabilizer, the lift generated by the engine cooling could be cancelled and the aircraft would remain stable. That system was called the MCAS. In particular, what the system does is to move the entire horizontal stabilizer plane. This is the trim of the Boeing 737. The stability of the aircraft changes in all flights depending on the number of passengers, the cargo, and how they are distributed. The horizontal stabilizer plane can move completely and set the optimal orientation angle for each flight or at each moment of the flight. The MCAS, the system that cancels out the extra lift generated by the cooling, what does is to move the entire stabilizer plane. That could lower the nose of the aircraft slightly. And if after 10 seconds too much angle of attack is still detected, the elevator is deflected a little more, and so after periods of 10 seconds. And here is where the problem appears. The system was incorporated into this new aircraft without informing the airlines or pilots, since the idea of Boeing was that the pilots didn't have to realize the difference between this new model and the previous versions. That was with the objective that a pilot of an old Boeing 737 could fly a Boeing 737 MAX without having to take another new aircraft type course. So far, nothing very unusual, as we can see. Everything made more or less sense, except the part of not reporting the MCAS system. However, the real underlying problem is that this system only took information from one single angle of attack sensor, so that if this failed and detected more angle of attack than the real one, the system would act and lower the nose of the aircraft even more, in a way not controllable for the pilots, and without them knowing what was happening and how to react to it. And this is what happened exactly in the Lion Air 610 accident in October 2019 in the Java Sea. Normally, the aeronautical authority says that a system that its failure can generate a catastrophic situation cannot depend on the failure of one single component. It must have redundancy. But here the situation gets even more complicated, because in December 2015, a Boeing worker began to ask by email to its superiors if the MCAS depended only on a single angle of attack sensor, because he wasn't convinced by this design idea. He was told that if the system found discrepancies between the two angle of attack sensor, it could shut down itself. Well, this was simply a lie, because in both accidents there were discrepancies and the system didn't shut down. Later in 2016, a Boeing test pilot doing a simulation testing noticed that the system got activated from time to time, causing the nose of the aircraft to go down, and literally said, "I don't think it's safe," and no one paid attention.
2 years later, the Lion Air Boeing 737 MAX crashed, and by that time, everyone knew that the MCAS was the problem, to such an extent that even I made a video talking about the MCAS in the Lion Air accident. Yes, but that time I was starting my YouTube career, so as you can see, everyone knew that the problem was the MCAS, but nobody took action. And then, almost 5 months later, the Ethiopian Airlines crashed.
In fact, action was taken, but it was shameful. On November 6, 2018, that is, after the first accident, it was the first time that the airlines were informed about the MCAS system, and it was explained that for high angles of attack, the aircraft could pull the nose down, and in case the system failed, what happened to the Lion Air airplane could happen again. So a statement was issued informing that the pilots in such a case should perform a runway stabilizer procedure, a type of emergency trained a lot in all types of Boeing 737. And when we look at what the pilots of the new Ethiopian accident did when they saw that the plane was going nose down without control, we see that the first thing they did was to perform this procedure. And at first it seems that it worked. However, later on, they give power again to the horizontal stabilizer and the MCAS was reactivated, and then they couldn't save it from diving into the surface of the Earth. We will make a specific video about these accidents where we will explain this part in detail, and also how the MCAS was not the only factor in the accident. Many other things have to be taken into account.
it is something that has not forgiveness. But I don't really think that the main problem was in Boeing. The FAA is the authority that has to certify that the airplane is safe. And of course, inside Boeing, all the engineers have to create the systems in a way that are safe. But the authority is the one that has to judge if they are safe or not. And in the case that they are not, the airplane cannot be certified.
But wait, because it gets even more complex. It turns out that in the USA, companies with a long history and complexity, such as Boeing, the aeronautical authority, the FAA, grant them a figure called ARS, Authorized Representatives. These people are in charge of, on behalf of the FAA, certifying certain processes within the aircraft design. This is done to speed up the work at the time of the certification, avoiding absurd bureaucracy in which you have to wait for a response in order to continue the process, you name it. Basically, it means that there are engineers working for Boeing who are given certain roles of authority. That is, in some cases, those who certify the safety of the system were not FAA workers independent of Boeing, but were Boeing's own workers who at the same time were also accountable to the FAA. And I remind you that they were designing the Boeing 737 MAX as fast as possible to be able to compete with the A320neo, which was overtaking Boeing and taking all the market. And so Boeing engineers, managers, and also the ARS had direct pressure from above to certify the safety of the system at the lowest cost and as soon as possible, when clearly the system wasn't safe. This doesn't only happen in the United States, but also in Europe. There is this figure within the companies that are in charge of certifying certain processes to speed up the certification. The problem is not that figure. The problem is that they were not completely objective and were very influenced by their superiors. For example, in 2016, an internal Boeing survey of the ARS was conducted to see whether or not they were conflicts of interest when performing their work. 39% claimed to work under pressure, and 29% claimed to be concerned if they reported that the pressure was excessive. This undoubtedly where the problem lies. The IRS figure has to be able to work completely without pressure or fear so that his actions are correct, and in complex and tense moments, the best decision is made. But the need to certify the aircraft as quickly as possible meant that in 2012, a lot of years before the certification of the aircraft, a pilot doing simulation testing encountered a situation like those in the accidents where the MCAS sent the nose of the aircraft down, and the pilot was unable to control the aircraft. The Boeing test pilot reported this as a catastrophic situation, but because of everything I explained, nobody listened to him. On March 10, 2019, the Ethiopian flight with 157 people on board crashed. The next day, the 11th, in China, the MAX was banned from flying over its airspace. The 12th, it was banned in Singapore, India, Turkey, South Korea, the European Union, Australia, and Malaysia, while the FAA issued a statement that the aircraft was still safe. Until the next day, March 13, they retracted and ordered the immediate grounding of all Boeing 737 MAX fleets. If you notice, it is incredible because the FAA, as it was who certified the safety of the aircraft, they didn't want under any circumstances to admit that they had done it wrong, and that is why they were the last ones to recognize that the aircraft wasn't safe. Since then, they have been working to fix the situation of the aircraft, and 2 years later, throughout 2021, the Boeing 737 MAX has been granted airworthiness again throughout all countries. If you're interested, leave in the comments and we will make a video explaining the changes that have been made in the Boeing 737 MAX. But it's important to say that right now, after 2 years of inspections, the Boeing 737 MAX is so safe. They couldn't afford another accident because of the negligence, so don't worry if you fly on a Boeing 737 MAX. The final document on the 737 MAX investigation says very harsh things, literal talking about the Boeing's culture of concealment or a Boeing influence on the FAA. Or perhaps both Boeing and the FAA gambled with the public safety in the aftermath of the Lion Air crash, resulting in the death of 157 more individuals on Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, less than 5 months later.
Okay, let's stop here for a moment because it's so easy to criticize something that we know how it ended. But I really think that the engineers that claim that the system was safe are good people that have normal families like you and I, for example, and they are even really good engineers. They really believe that the system was safe. They probably knew that something was weird, but they never thought that it would create an accident in the future. In addition to that, they were receiving direct messages from their superiors telling them that the airplane had to be ready as soon as possible. And if they didn't sign it as soon as possible, Boeing would go into losses and therefore thousands of people would be fired. Really, put you in this situation is so complicated. In fact, I'm sure that even you and me would have done exactly the same as they did. This is because people love to think that we are special, but we are not. We are not different from anybody. In the same situation with the same conditions, we probably have acted in the same way. Also, only a few engineers inside Boeing broke the law. Everyone else was pressured by loopholes, so they didn't know what to do. On the one hand, you could be one of the heroes that worked on the Boeing 737 MAX, the airplane that was going to battle against Airbus, or on the other hand, you could be one of the engineers that made Boeing going into bankrupt.
That is why in real life it is important to analyze the consequences that your actions may have, and in situations of pressure to analyze if there are interests that are blinding reality, or if you are making the decision because of pressures from above. It is very complicated. In the case of engineers and maintainers, when repairs are made to aircraft, they have to sign off once they have been done as a confirmation that the aircraft is ready to fly again.
Put yourself in a situation in which you are part of a team that are making a reparation, for example, in the wing of an airplane, and your superiors are telling you that the airplane has to be ready for leaving in 3 days. And imagine that you are the last person that is going to sign the document that says that the airplane is ready to leave. And then the last day you discover that the reparation hasn't been done perfect. That, for example, in a wing that has 50 rivets, imagine, 2 of them are rivets of a previous models that are not the newest. What would you do? Everyone else tells you that you have to sign the document because just 2 rivets, there's nothing to worry about. And then you say, okay, I'm going to read the document in which the authorities talk about the rivets. And you go, you read, and they say, the airplane has to have all the rivets. Okay, the airplane in your reparation has all the rivets. Just 2 of them are not the newest models. What would you do? Don't forget that your superiors are telling you that you have to have the airplane ready. Not easy at all.
Really, what could you do? In cold blood, most of us would probably say that we wouldn't sign the document, but really, put yourself in the situation. With this video, you have been able to see all the psychology behind the aeronautical projects, because despite being machines designed based on science, they're designed by people, and the behavior of this in critical situations is very interesting. Please consider subscribe if you're not, and see you in the next video. And remember always to think supersonic.